Okay, hey y'all. So welcome to this week's current events and 2020 election update stream. So I'm Fatma Raja. Usually Robbie May is here and he's a teacher, but this week he can't be because he's feeling a bit under the weather, but we're gonna do our best to get on without him. I turned 18 last month, so I will be old enough to vote. But oh, yeah, it's always like you miss the cutoff and then you can't vote that year, but it's fine. There's always like the next election that comes around. Okay, so we'll just dive right into it. So make sure you're following Fiveable across all of their social media so you can get updates about when all of us are streaming and what subjects are going to be live that day. And so it's at Think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and on YouTube. We're going to first be talking a little bit about what's been happening this week. Then we're going to be talking about what's happening with impeachment, then foreign policy and how the United States pulled out of Syria, then both Democratic and events that have been happening, and some overall election hacking fiascos that have been happening in the last few months. Okay, so first, with impeachment on September 30th, of 2019, obviously, just like last week, House Democrats subpoenaed Rudy Giuliani. And so he's Trump's personal attorney, which means he doesn't actually work for the government. He works for President Trump. And so they asked him to turn over documents that were related to Donald Trump's efforts to have Ukraine investigate the Bidens. And so pretty much what happened, if you weren't able to tune in to last week's stream, Rudy Giuliani, who was President Trump's personal attorney and still is, he had documents in his possession that were pretty much damning evidence, potentially, that Donald Trump had asked Ukraine to investigate the Bidens. And so if you also looked at the transcript that was released or heard about it in the news, you would also know that in that transcript, Donald Trump pretty heavily implied that he would withhold aid from Ukraine if they didn't actually investigate the Bidens. So that was pretty bad. But that on October 3rd, which was just a few days ago, Donald Trump also publicly asked China to investigate the Bidens. So this was pretty similar to the request that he made to Ukraine, which is the reason that the entire impeachment inquiry started. So you might think that he would avoid publicly asking a different country to investigate his political opponent. But the reasoning behind it was that if he made the request publicly, then it's not a crime. So do with that information what you will. But pretty much what his reasoning was that because the request had been made publicly, he couldn't actually be prosecuted for it because it wasn't something that was happening under the table and it wasn't really like coercion or blackmail. It was just sort of like, hey, China, investigate the Bidens. So yeah. And then on October 4th, which was once again just a few days ago, another intelligence official came forward with concerns and knowledge that he had about President Trump's dealings with Ukraine. And so that person, he, she, they, is also considering filing a whistleblower complaint. And so the House Committee on Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Oversight subpoenaed the White House to hand over the documents that are related to the investigation. So it's becoming more and more clear that the Ukraine incident, President Donald Trump asked them to investigate the Bidens, is very quickly turning into what the Democrats and the House is going to be using in order to fuel their impeachment inquiry. And so it's becoming a broader investigation, not just focused on that one event. And so we're going to go through a couple of President Trump's tweets just because they tend to be very publicized in the news. And so there might not be a lot of fact checking that happens. So we're going to do that for you guys. So just a few days ago, President Donald Trump tweeted that the Biden family was paid off. And so that's why they're asking Ukraine to investigate him. And so Sleepy Joe, who in this case is President Trump's nickname for presidential candidate Joe Biden, said that he didn't speak to the Ukrainian company. And so he alluded that there was a picture where there was a game of golf being played between the boss of the company and Hunter. And Hunter is Joe Biden's, or one of his sons. His name's Hunter Biden. And so what that photo that Trump is referencing appears to have is that it's not actually Joe Biden playing golf with a boss of Burisma Holdings, which is the Ukrainian natural gas company where Hunter Biden used to be a board member. It's the person in the photo is named Devin Archer, and he's an American. And so he's been a business associate of Hunter Biden for a very long time. So they've served on the Bureau. Oh, Ashley asked, what's subpoenaed mean? So a subpoena is pretty much like a request for information. So if Congress or the courts can subpoena someone, and so it means that they have to come testify. And so subpoena for documents, it means that those documents have to be turned over. So yeah, that's what subpoena means. But back to this Trump tweet. So Devin Archer was pretty much just a longtime business associate of Hunter Biden. And so that's the guy that Joe Biden was playing golf with. And so the important thing to remember is that someone who's on the board of a company doesn't necessarily really run everything that's happening in the company. So they're not an executive or the company boss. So there's parts of that which are misleading. So another tweet that was very blown up was that the first so-called secondhand information whistleblower got my phone almost completely wrong. So it is that they're going to bench, and another whistleblower is coming in from the deep state, along with secondhand info. Meet with Shifty. Keep them coming. So Donald Trump tweeted that on October 5th. And so whistleblower is his reference to the first whistleblower. And so what's important to remember there is that it was found that his account of the call was pretty accurate, and it was not almost completely wrong. So that's the exact opposite of what Donald Trump said. So in the transcript that was released by the White House and President Trump himself showed that the whistleblower's primary allegations about the call were all pretty much on the nose, or they were very close. So in addition to that, the Inspector General for the Intelligence Committee said that the first whistleblower had direct knowledge of certain alleged conduct, along with information that the whistleblower was told by others. So they're pretty much saying that first whistleblower had not only that he had obtained himself, but also that what knowledge that he was told by other people familiar with what happened. So that's also what happened with that tweet. So what an impeachment inquiry looks like. So Ashley asks, can't Trump get in trouble for lying then? Well, that's what we would think, right? But the thing to remember is Congress is the branch of government that is in charge of checking the president. So on top of that, there's a lot of different opinions whether or not a sitting president can be indicted for a crime like lying. And so the three main things that presidents get impeached for, and pretty much the only things in the Constitution that presidents can be impeached for, is high crimes and misdemeanors, treason, and pretty much crimes where they're putting the country in jeopardy. So because just lying isn't really something that's a crime, the president may or may not be able to get in trouble. But that's the point of the impeachment inquiry, because if there's stuff happening behind the scenes that we don't know about, then there's really a case for impeachment, or there may not be. But he can't really get in trouble for just lying, because people in public office lie all the time, and occasionally are punished by the people not reelecting them. But there's really no official crime that's oh, you can't lie in public office. Oh, hey Dylan, glad you decided to tune in. So the way that impeachment inquiry works is that if the House of Representatives can introduce a impeachment resolution, and so the causes behind that can be treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. So high crimes and misdemeanors are intentionally a little bit vague. So if something happens that doesn't fall under treason or bribery, the House of Representatives have some leeway to figure out how they are going to define that crime. So then the House Judiciary Committee analyzes those accusations and draws up the articles of impeachment. So every step of the way, the only thing that's needed in the House in order for a step of impeachment to proceed forward is a majority. So after the House of Representatives debates and decides to forward that articles of impeachment, the Senate is actually the body that conducts the trial. So the Chief Justice of the United States gets to head that trial, and the jury is made up of US senators. So people from the House of Representatives pretty much Oh, okay. So Dylan asks, when you say lying, do you mean just lying in general or lying under oath? Since isn't lying under oath an impeachable offense? Yeah. So lying under oath is considered perjury. But like if a politician just like, or in this case, the president of the United States just tweets something that isn't factual, that's not a crime. But lying under oath when you're sworn to tell the truth is a crime. And if you perjure yourself, you will potentially be impeached, like what happened in the Clinton impeachment case. So yeah, that's an important clarification to make. Thanks, Dylan. Okay, so then if so the House of Representatives, like I said, will be able to act as pretty much the prosecutors. So they talk about what they like drew up in their articles of impeachment and make the case for the president being removed from office. And so the Senate gets to deliberate that. And if 2/3 of the Senate vote for impeachment or for conviction and removal, the president gets removed. But so far in history, we've had presidents that were impeached, but never people who were actually removed from office. In a couple cases, they just resigned before the impeachment happened, so they wouldn't be removed. So now that we've covered what's been happening in impeachment news, let's look at foreign policy. So the US in the last few weeks is withdrawing from Syria because President Trump decided to pull those troops out of the country and allowed for the Turkish government to step in and implement their military offensive. And so Senator Lindsey Graham said that the impulsive decision by the president has undone all gains that we've made and thrown the region into further chaos. So what Senator Graham is trying to say there is that because the US presence in Syria had been so strong for such a long time, when the United States all of a sudden pulls out of that region, it leaves pretty much a power vacuum that isn't really filled quickly enough. So there's more chaos that erupts as different groups try to vie for power and actually become the dominant power in the region. So even though the Turkish government is going to be filling the United States' shoes potentially with a military offensive, what Senator Lindsey Graham is trying to say is that it might not be enough and it might not be quick enough for that transition to occur. So President Trump decided to pull the troops out because it was pretty much what he was saying, an endless war that was a waste of time that the United States didn't really get a benefit out of. And so he talked about how the United States had been in Syria for a very long time and involved in the Middle East for even longer. And so he was saying that it's part of an endless war. So that's why he decided to pull the troops out. But Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican senator, is making the case that it might not be the most beneficial foreign policy move that the Trump administration could have made. So now that we've also talked about foreign policy, let's move on from the Trump administration to people vying to be part of the new administrations that are coming in 2020 if they're elected into office. So there has been recent news that Democratic donors on Wall Street and in big businesses are saying that they're not going to donate to Senator Elizabeth Warren if she wins the Democratic nomination. And so the reason why that is because we'll look into that on the next slide, but some of them have also said that they're going to donate to President Trump instead. So the reason why they're saying that is because Elizabeth Warren is a very outspoken critic of big banks and corporations. And so a few of her positions in the past that are influencing people to say that they're not going to donate to her is that she chaired the Congressional Oversight Panel of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, and she was key in creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And so what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is it pretty much advocates for consumer interests when it comes to things like student loans or when it comes to other things like mortgages. So it's trying to make sure that big businesses and banks aren't able to abuse small people and consumers at large. So Dylan asks, is Warren even accepting large donations from big businesses and super PACs in the first place? As a relatively progressive Democrat, I wouldn't expect her to following in the footsteps of Sanders and other progressives. So that's actually really interesting. She's not accepting any money from super PACs, but at the current moment, it's obvious that Democratic donors, in some cases, are thinking that that might change in the future. And also, those donors could donate potentially to the Democratic National Committee. And so that make its way to Elizabeth Warren in the long run. But if they're choosing to just donate to Trump directly overall, that would change. And so he would get a boost out of that because it wouldn't balance out in terms of funding. But back to Elizabeth Warren, two more of the reasons is because on the campaign trail, she's released multiple plans to curb Wall Street influence. And so that's stuff like the wealth tax, where people who earn above a certain amount of money, often in like the dozens of millions, will be taxed a higher rate because of it. And so she's also introduced bills that will curb lobbying in her term as a senator. So those are two really big reasons that people who are on Wall Street or part of big businesses believe that if she's potentially elected president, she will have enough power in order to curb their industry's influence on Congress and potentially raise taxes for them, which a lot of businesses don't want to happen. Alternatively, President Trump has said that he has given huge tax breaks to big corporations. And so he's, through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, if you guys remember a few years ago, he decreased real tax rates for corporations by half. And so he was also a businessman himself, so he has those interests in mind. So Brandon says that he read somewhere that Warren said she'd accept corporate money during the general election. So yeah, I didn't read that same article myself, but it's possible that that's a strategy that she's considering, especially because right now the Democratic grassroots energy is really focused on individual donors and keeping corporate money out. But during a general election where most Democrats are just focused on winning against a Republican, they might not consider that to be as much as a determining factor when it comes to choosing someone to vote for president. And so Dylan also says that he wonders if economic policy under the Trump administration, such as the trade war and a strong domestic economy, has boosted big business support of Donald Trump. So in terms of the trade war, that really hasn't been beneficial to big businesses when it comes to agriculture and stuff. But the mere idea that they'll get tax breaks under President Trump and higher taxes under Elizabeth Warren is something that big businesses are going to weigh when it comes to donating to a candidate in the general election. Okay, so looking more into fundraising, let's look deeper into what's happened in the third quarter. So the third quarter happened from July to the end of September. So some winners were Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So Bernie Sanders has raised the most amount of money in the election so far. And in the third quarter, he raised $25 million. And that's adding to the total which he has raised, which is $71 million for the entire year. And so that's because during the 2016 election, he was really able to cultivate this huge donor base. And so because he was so focused on getting grassroots, unique, non-PAC money, those people obviously are still looking for a candidate. And so Bernie Sanders, because he's running again, has presented himself as the pretty much lead option for a lot of people who donated to him in 2016. So Elizabeth Warren also raised $24.5 million or thereabouts. And so what that's showing is that she has a lot of sustained growth that's happening. So that's an increase from what she raised in the second quarter. And so it's showing that she's able to gain national support, especially when you compare to the fact that Bernie Sanders raised $25 million and Elizabeth Warren didn't run in 2016. So in the third quarter, it's becoming clear that she's being able to catch up to Bernie Sanders, who was pretty much the lead progressive in the race before she joined. And so now Joe Biden, former vice president, raised $15 million. And so that was actually less than what he raised in the second quarter, $6.5 million less. And so the idea that he's the front runner of the entire Democratic nominee election is sort of something that's beginning to be questioned by a lot of people, because generally you would assume that as it gets closer into an election season and more people are dropping out, that candidates who are strong are going to be increasing the amount of money that they're raising, which is what's happening in Warren and Sanders' case. But in Joe Biden's case, the exact opposite happened. And so Pete Buttigieg, who's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, raised $4 million more than Joe Biden. And so considering the fact that you're comparing the amount of money that a mayor of a small town in Indiana raised to a former vice president, it's obvious that these numbers aren't looking great for Joe Biden. So in terms of fundraising, he probably came out a loser for the third quarter. And so also during the third quarter, Cory Booker sent out an email saying that he was going to drop out of the race if he didn't reach a certain goal to qualify for the debates. And so he did end up reaching that goal and qualified for the debates. But the important thing to remember there is you don't really want to tell your supporters that you're going to drop out of the race because you haven't been able to like actually raise enough money. So maybe that was a push for his supporters to actually end up donating, but it's also a odd strategy if you want to win a nomination to be considered in the general election. So also, what's been happening on the Republican side of things? So there's currently 3 people that are challenging Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. And those 3 people are Mark Sanford, who is the former Republican governor of South Carolina, Joe Walsh, who was the former representative to the House from Illinois, and former Massachusetts governor Bill Weld. So these names are not very well known on the national stage. So you can just look from the left to the right, and that's them in the order that they appear in the actual bullet point on the screen. So yeah, all 3 of them are challenging Donald Trump for the nomination. And so obviously President Trump isn't worried about it at all because he's not even going to be debating any of the challengers. So last week, if you tuned into the stream, we talked about how Business Insider hosted their own non-RNC sponsored debate. And so President Trump wasn't there. And even one of the people running in the primary against President Donald Trump decided not to show up. So he said that he doesn't even, quote, know who they are and that their campaigns are a publicity stunt. And so he also went on to say that they're at less than 1% in the polls. So President Trump isn't really considering any of them to be a significant challenge when it comes to him winning the nomination. And so another thing that's happened, and probably one of the reasons why President Trump doesn't consider them to be a threat, is because a lot of Republican states, or majority Republican states like South Carolina, have decided to cancel their primaries. So 2 states, Nevada and South Carolina, recently voted earlier in the week to not even hold primaries. So that means that people who are registered as Republicans can go and be like, oh, I want to vote for Bill Weld. And so it's not really a factor. It means that they're going to be pretty much automatically saying that Donald Trump is going to be the Republican candidate on the ticket. And so Dylan asks, is anything going on with the third parties, or is it basically just GOP and Dems getting coverage for now? Yeah, pretty much the only 2 parties that are getting coverage right now, a big reason for that being that we have a system that's very dominated by 2 parties, Republicans and Democrats, is, yeah, they're pretty much the only 2 parties getting coverage. And so I'm pretty sure the Green Party isn't even going to be nominating someone this year, but it could be a different one. So I'll check and update you guys on that in the next week's stream. So Ashley says, it doesn't seem very fair. Yeah, and that's true. That's exactly why 2 Republicans are suing the South Carolina Republican Party over their decision to cancel the primary. And so what they're arguing is it deprives people of their right to vote for their choice candidate. And so this presumably is something that violates the Republican Party's rules. And so one of the plaintiffs in the case is former Congressman Bob Inglis. And so they're pretty much trying to say, what they're trying to say is that regardless of whether or not President Trump is going to win the Republican nomination in the end, people still deserve the chance to decide whether or not that's what they want to be voting for on the ticket. So another thing, and the reason why these states have cited for canceling their primaries, is the fact that they would save hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, which I think it was South Carolina said they would save $2.4 million. And so that seems like something that's in the interest of a state party, right? Because then they could just, yeah, so Dylan says they canceled the primaries and said, give the delegates to Trump. Yeah, that's pretty much what they did, because everyone's assuming that he would win that nomination anyways. So there wouldn't really be a point in wasting resources to hold a primary election when they could just use those in the general instead. So that's the reason why those primaries were canceled in Kansas, Arizona, Nevada, and South Carolina. So on top of that, there's also been a lot of stuff happening in the elections and them being hacked. So I'm going to start with the bullet point at the bottom, but in July, Microsoft flagged around 800 cyber attacks, and so they were being perpetrated by nation states on political organizations. So if you guys remember in 2016, or you may not remember, and either of those states are completely fine, is that what happened was a lot of different countries, and by a lot, I pretty much just mean Russia, attempted to like hack into different like election voting machines. And so what they did in some cases was just like scanning, which means that they looked at the information on those voting machines. And so something to know about American election like technology is that it's kind of outdated, and there hasn't really been like a national push to get like updated voting security for a while. So that's why we are at where we are now. So just Microsoft reported that Phosphorus, which is a group of Iranian hackers, made around more than 2,700 attempts to identify people's emails over a 30-day period in August to September. And the way that they like to identify people's email accounts was very sophisticated, and they used a lot of different personal information. And so the group is linked to the Iranian government. And so the idea that there's more foreign actors trying to interfere in American elections is very worrying, especially when we saw what happened in 2016. So the group attacked more than 200 accounts, and so some of those accounts belong to people who were associated with different US presidential campaigns. So we don't know what campaigns specifically were targeted, but there was someone who came forward and said that one of them was associated with like the Trump campaign, and that's what the Iranian government was trying to do. Actually compromised in the end, and none of them were associated or the federal government, but it still means that there is a concerted attempt by a foreign actor trying to influence the American electoral process, which is very worrying. So not in response to this, but before that happened, the Senate Appropriations Committee included around $300 million in funding to help boost our election security. And so what this means is that in the 2020 Annual Financial Services and General Government Funding Bill, the Election Assistance Commission is going to choose to allocate that money to the states however they choose. But the thing to remember, or two things, is that first, the House wanted to give a lot more money, around $600 million, which would be double what the Senate decided on. And so although they are going to go into committee and decide what the final number is, the Senate wants to give way less money. But experts say that even what the House is saying isn't enough, and that billions of dollars are needed to actually make sure that the election is secure. And so what we're looking at on top of that is that companies like Microsoft, Facebook, and Twitter, they're also trying to take steps to prevent hacks and the circulation of misinformation. So in 2016, a lot of misinformation by like pretty much these like Russian bots. And so those in order to like perpetuate misinformation and spread that around the web. So companies like Microsoft make sure that that doesn't happen again in 2020.